All right, I think I am live. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's an honor and really a pleasure to be here with a lot of friends and very smart and respected people that I've learned a lot from. And this is where I used to teach in this room with Kate Canoe, so it's really fun to be back here. Today I want to talk about energy transformation. And my basic premise is that I believe that this is the most transformational decade that we will experience in our energy systems since rural electrification, since the time back in the 1930s when the very first electricity wires were strung across the United States out to farms and across rural America, and people turned on electric lights for the first time. This photo is from Georgia in 1937, where these school kids got a chance to have a light bulb in their classroom for the very first time. So I want to talk about what the drivers of change are that are moving towards this transformation and talk about why this matters for Minnesota and for the world. So first, let's go back about a century and start there. Because really, in the last 100 years, the electricity system hasn't changed all that much. So if you look at the dizzying speed of telephones and their transformation in comparison, it's pretty stunning. So if Alexander Graham Bell came back from the dead, he would not recognize our telecommunication system, our modern one, would he? And we don't have a photo of him doing that. This is the best we could do. But if Thomas Edison came back from the dead, he would look around and say, it looks just like it did when I left. So let's talk about Thomas Edison for a moment. So back in 1875, he invented the first incandescent light bulb, and he started creating electric companies. And pretty soon he brought in some wealthy investors like J.P. Morgan to help finance these electric companies, because while fuel costs, mostly for coal, were quite cheap, the capital costs and the infrastructure to build big centralized power plants and long-distance transmission lines required an enormous amount of capital. So these huge amounts of capital needed to build and maintain the electricity system are really what led to our current system that most states still use of a regulated monopoly utility system. Now, back in about a century ago or so, and in Edison's day, a lot of electric companies actually, when they were starting out, gave away things like light bulbs and electric irons to encourage more electricity use, because their business model was very simple. The more electricity we sell, the more money we make. At that time, however, coal plants were, and honestly still are, quite inefficient. And if you look at a train car going by today, I think I've read that coal plants in those early days were about 1% efficient. So it's improved a lot. Now it's up to about 33% efficient, somewhere between 30 and 40%. So if you look at a train of coal cars going by, 2 out of every 3 of those piles of coal will go up in smoke or waste heat, and only 1 of the 3 will be able to transform into useful energy, generally. So now let's talk about the transformation. The question is, how will the electricity system evolve from the last century's models? How quickly, and what direction will that take? So since I'm about to make a prediction, I'm going to start with one of my very favorite philosophers who I quote a lot. You all know who he is, Yogi Berra, who said, among other really brilliant things, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And so I take that to heart, and nevertheless, I'm going to make some bold predictions, which are that 10 or 20 years from now, 10 or 15 years from now, let's say by 2025 or 2030, we won't recognize our electricity system either. And really, this is despite the fact that we have an enormous political battle going on in our country over climate change and energy policy. Despite that, I believe that the energy system will and is becoming significantly cleaner and less polluting, more distributed and less centralized, and more controlled by customers. And that traditional business models and traditional utility economics are going to evolve. And many of these trends, I think, are going to lead to some tipping points that will really be more transformational. So here's my slide full of words that I want you to read really quickly, but I'm going to go through these one at a time. I came up with a list of some major drivers of change that I've identified in the electricity/energy system. And I'll go through each of these one at a time. You may have other ideas. There's lots of other drivers. But let me start with these. First, coal's dramatic decline in the United States. Coal is rapidly, whoops, I'll go back to that in a moment. Coal is rapidly losing its position as the dominant electricity source in the United States. About 10, 15 years ago, when I was in the legislature, there was a time when about 150 new coal plants were proposed for the United States, for many different states. Over the next few years, very, very few of those actually were built. And now things have shifted so much that in the last, say, 3 years, some 150 more have been slated for retirement. They've either retired or announced their retirement. So things are moving in the opposite direction. And it's probably not news to you to say that coal's declining share in the marketplace is driven by largely market factors to date, as well as environmental rules. So hydraulic fracturing of natural gas that's made it relatively economical to extract large amounts of low-cost natural gas from the ground has really pushed coal's economics hard because it's coming in at lower prices and is very competitive. Increasing amounts of low-cost renewable energy are putting pressure on coal's economics, especially in places like the Midwest, where wind resources are growing very, very quickly. And finally, those EPA rules. The EPA announced rules that come from the Clean Air Act that's been around since the 1970s. But the question really has been over the last few years, how much teeth will be in those rules? And it seems apparent that they're going to be fairly tough. And the President and the EPA recently rolled out their draft rules for new plants. And there's a process underway to decide on the rules for existing plants. And they look like they will be pretty significantly requiring major environmental retrofits to reduce, besides other forms of pollutants, carbon pollution. So the CEO of Xcel Energy, which covers an 8-state area and is our biggest utility, the CEO, Ben Folk, recently said that the political and regulatory reality is that it's going to be next to impossible to build a new coal plant in the United States. So my conclusion or prediction is that new coal plants around the country are going to be far and few between, fairly unlikely, and that the fleet of existing plants is going to continue to shrink. And I think also if EPA rules come in fairly tough, that actually move the country towards meeting the president's goals that he set in Copenhagen of 17% reductions by 2020, and that's economy-wide greenhouse gas reductions. Because of these rules, even though there is no congressional action, with genuine limits on CO2 emissions, our country will, for the first time in a long time, have a credible and strong position in global negotiations, which could be a game changer. So, second big driver of change is the growth of renewable energy. Since 2010, global investment in renewable energy started surpassing global dollars going into new fossil fuel investment. And that trend has continued for the last 3 years. And that's in billions of dollars. There's been some research done about scenarios for renewable energy growth. And somebody did kind of aggregated all the studies and found that the history of energy scenarios is full of dozens of projections for renewable energy that proved too low by a factor of 10 that the growth has actually far surpassed expectations of everyone from government agencies to environmental groups to industry groups. If you look at more than 50 reports, they were way too low by a factor of 10 because the growth has been so fast and exponentially bigger than expected. So just in the last couple of years in the United States, wind installations and generations have grown, say, 25 to 30%. Solar has grown over 50% in the last 7 to 8 years. So if you look at one projection for new energy supplies, this is from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They are suggesting, based on those global investment numbers and based on what they see the marketplace doing, not necessarily accounting for major policy changes at the national level, they see that new energy supplies added through 2030 put the smart money really on renewables, and they predict that 70% of new generation capacity added between now and 2030 will be in renewable technologies versus about 25% in coal, gas, or oil and nuclear. So another big trend with this large kind of explosion in renewable energy is that prices have also been dropping, and a lot of you have seen these numbers before, solar PV in particular. The pricing worldwide has been dropping dramatically for the last few years. In some markets in the United States, it's now competitive with existing power plants. And wind in places like the Midwest, where we've installed a lot of wind, has become so low cost with new installations that it's driving wholesale prices down in the whole Midwestern marketplace. So the prices are going down, the amounts of generation and new installations are going up. And finally, state policies are driving change. And I've been talking about this for a lot of years because in Minnesota, back in 2007, we passed our state renewable energy standard. By now, just about 30 states, if you include Washington, D.C. and some territories, have renewable energy portfolio standards in place, in law, that require a certain percent of electricity to come from renewable sources by a certain date. Now, what's interesting is that there's been a concerted effort, a concerted political effort by some conservative groups around the country to repeal these laws. And as you can see from this chart, with the approximately 30 states, that their populations would represent about the 5th largest country in the world. So that's a lot of people that live in states that have this sort of policy in place. And that political effort to repeal these laws, even in red states, has been 100% unsuccessful. So I think that's been really interesting. So these state policies are driving change, and I think the states that have these, by and large, if I can generalize, have kept them because they've seen industry development, they've seen jobs created, and they've gotten more public support over time. Not all of them, but many of them. So, third big driver of change I'll touch on quickly, distributed generation. I went too quickly. Broad deployment and dropping prices of renewable energy have made it possible for more and more people to install their own form of renewable energy generation, whether it's solar panels or a wind turbine or a geothermal system or a biomass burner. It's very difficult to put a large coal plant or nuclear plant on your back 40 acres, but you can do a small renewable energy installation. And that is a game changer in a lot of ways, and we'll talk about that more when we get back to the utility models, because it's creating some real challenges to existing utility models. Another driver of change is energy efficiency, and you hear often about refrigerators that if you bought a refrigerator back in the 1970s and you just replaced it, or you have a modern one, without even trying to get a more efficient refrigerator, that's all that's in the marketplace. They're dramatically more efficient because of technological advances, and in some cases because of of government standards. So overall, in Minnesota and in the United States, electricity demand is relatively flat. It's slowed down from what all those projections were a few years ago. And a lot of utilities are delivering energy efficiency. There's lots of ways it's happening, but in Minnesota in particular, a lot of the energy efficiency work is driven by state laws that require utilities to help their customers save energy. And for Xcel Energy, for example, they, in their region, have avoided building something on the order of 10 new power plants because of the energy savings that they can count, that they've implemented in their area. So that's changing things a lot. The smart grid. This is a picture that talks about the smart grid, and there's people in this room that know a lot more about it than I do. But this is just a demonstration of some of the things that happen when you take that old electric grid that I mentioned and combine it with modern digital technology and modern communications technology. And it allows real-time, two-way communication and control over what's happening on the grid. And you know, these boxes tell you some of the things that can happen with that. Energy from small generators and solar panels can reduce demand on the grid at peak hours of the day. Storage. When you have storage, a smarter grid can incorporate that, and energy generated at off-peak times can be stored in batteries for later use. Demand management, meaning use can be shifted again to times when the demand isn't as high. So the grid can, and your smartphone can tell your dishwasher when to run or when other appliances should be turned on. Sensors can signal and separate out microgrid areas in times of blackouts or high energy demand. Appliances, smart appliances can shut off and on, etc. So there's all kinds of possibilities that are going to, when fully implemented, be game changers for how we as consumers can control our energy usage and how utilities and power generators, whoever they are, can better control their choices of electricity generation, what fuel's being used at what particular time, and how efficiently it's delivered. So another big driver of change is market changes. And I think this is really remarkable because the lack of a price on carbon has been called the biggest market failure of all time. And that's still the case. That really would correct the inequities in the marketplace and account for externalities to put a cost on pollution that's emitted into the atmosphere. Despite the fact that our country has not passed a policy, an explicit national policy, that does do that, some gigantic market players are making some of those changes themselves, and because they're so big, they're driving major transformations just through their purchasing. And I just want to give a couple of examples. One is the Department of Defense. This is from an article in The Atlantic. They, as an entity, the Department of Defense is the single largest petroleum user in the United States. So they have a big impact on the market. And it's also obviously for them an economic and security issue. And their leadership has talked about this a lot. And they've talked about how much fuel has to be transported in all kinds of military activities. And for every 24 fuel convoys the United States transported in Afghanistan, someone was killed or wounded in action, a soldier or a civilian contractor. So it's a very dangerous part of their work. And besides the cost in lives, they see it as a cost to security and a risk. And so they have set very, very high goals. The Defense Department goal is for 25% of their energy to be from renewables by 2025, and that's economy-wide, not just electricity. The Navy goal is even higher. 50% of their energy consumption is to come from non-fossil sources by 2020. And the Navy has this great green fleet that they are putting together that's going to try to run their submarines and ships on non-fossil fuels. And they're demonstrating them right now. So another big market player that you might love to hate is our good friend Walmart. And whatever you might think of them, Walmart is huge and their goals are ambitious. So the scale of their impact on the market is potentially enormous. They have a goal of 100% renewable energy to reduce energy needs in their buildings by 20%. And in terms of scale, if Walmart were a country, it would be the 25th largest economy in the world. So that's some real money in play. That's a lot of people, and that's a lot of purchasing power. Their supply chain is worth billions. Now, I know they haven't fully implemented or actualized all of these goals, but a number of them are moving forward, and they are working through their supply chain to require their suppliers, which is that billions of dollars of market, to comply with these goals over time. So it will hugely impact the marketplace if it's fully implemented. So another big driver that I want to focus on for a moment is public opinion. Because as a former politician, I know that that eventually, usually, drives policy changes and government changes. Sometimes it takes a while. So what I am really struck by is that the support for clean energy has only strengthened over the last decade. It has not gone down. It's only gotten higher despite all the political infighting that we see in our political system over these issues. And I know this for a fact because when I worked for many years as a legislator to pass that renewable energy standard, it took 6 years. And every year I would look at the polling across Minnesota and know that Minnesotans wanted more deployment of wind and solar and cleaner energy sources. And it didn't matter what political party they voted for or where they lived. It was universal across our state, and it was a strong majority. And the recent polling that I've seen nationally says that 87% of Americans say the president and the Congress should make developing sources of clean energy a priority and support research and rebates for solar and for energy-efficient vehicles. Sorry. 70% of Americans in 2013 say global warming should be a priority for the president and for Congress. And even Tea Party members want to get in on the act of moving towards energy self-reliance. This kind of blew my mind. So take a look at this. In Georgia, and this is also happening in this conversation in Wisconsin, the leader of the Tea Party in Georgia made an alliance with the Sierra Club to advocate at their Public Utilities Commission for the ability for homeowners to put up solar on their homes, on their farms, on their small businesses. And she said it's about individual liberty. And she's right. It's about the ability to be self-reliant. And so we'll see if the Green Tea Coalition gets anywhere. If it does, you heard about it here first. But there are growing voting blocks. And if you look at polling that separates out minority communities and millennial age groups, you will find that their support among African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans is stronger than that of generally the broad cross-section of Americans for these kinds of policies that I just mentioned. And that's definitely true for millennials, which I think is born after 1980 is the definition, or is it 1990? I've heard different ones. And they say that people who deny global warming are out of touch. It's that simple. So in Minnesota, likewise, as I mentioned, the strong support for these policies continues. This this polling is from about a year ago, January 2012, so a year and a half, 2 years ago. But there's similar polling from 2013. And again, these numbers are higher than they were 10 years ago when I was trying to pass the renewable energy standard, where they were in the mere 70 percentile. So it cuts across party lines and geography. So I think the people know this is a good path for us. So one more driver of change that I think is really significant is that we've really hit a place where, because energy demand is relatively flat, and by the way, this has sustained over several years, and so at first people thought it's just the recession, economic growth is slow, but it seems to have hit some level of sustainability, that demand is flattening out. At the same time, obviously that drives emissions flattening out, as well as the increases in shifting to cleaner sources of energy. But as the economy has recovered and the GDP has grown, you can see that orange line is going up. And what this says is that we have shown in the United States that we can decouple carbon emissions from economic growth. And that is a major critical paradigm shift, because I think that's what holds so many people back, and so much of the political debate is about a fear that action on climate and on clean energy would cost jobs and hurt the economy. And I think what we are starting to see is that there's ample evidence that it can be an enormous economic opportunity and create a sustainable economy. It can be good for jobs. So, despite all these trends that I see that make me feel fairly optimistic that things are moving in a new direction, not everybody agrees with me that a transition to clean energy is relatively inevitable. And so there's some major challenges. And I just want to highlight 3 of those. And the first one kind of speaks for itself: US politics. Not much to say about that. We all know we're not getting very far in terms of reaching agreement or setting policies that will drive our energy system forward at the national level. But there is a huge amount of activity at the state, local, regional, and community level that is influencing the direction that things go. Secondly, developing countries, of course, are growing quickly and are adding a lot of energy generation capacity as they grow, and as they grow their middle class and their industrial capacities. And roughly 1,200 coal plants now are planned in about 59 countries around the world. Most of them, or 3/4 of them, in China and India. And so in terms of global impacts on carbon emissions and clean energy, it's hard to tell what direction things will go. But China, as you've probably heard, is getting a lot of pushback on air quality and air pollution. And China, while they're investing heavily in coal, is also the world's leading investor in clean energy. So I think they're hedging their bets on both sides, and they're moving forward in a parallel track as quickly as possible. And then another more local, I'm not ready for that. Sorry, I don't have a slide for this. Another more local, regional, and state issue that is somewhat of a challenge is those utility models that I mentioned, and those utility models of the past. And I'll just very briefly mention those because I don't want to take too much more time. But we talked about 100 years ago, and in Edison's time, the incentive for companies was to sell as much energy as possible, and that's how they made their money. And also to finance the large capital improvements that were made. Those are what allowed the utilities access to the financing to build the infrastructure. They had to invest in capital improvements, and the regulatory system allowed them to do that. But now there's a lot of forces that are kind of poking holes in that, and the more energy efficiency you have, the less sales utilities have. They're going to have to find a new way to make money while selling less of their product. And the more distributed generation you have, the more people are taking away the generation need that the utility is providing and not wanting to pay for those big fixed costs that contribute to the broader grid and the transmission lines. And the infrastructure that we talked about is aging, and it needs updating, and that's expensive. So there's a lot of people around the country that are talking about new utility models, how they will evolve over time. And clearly, I don't know the answer to what those will look like, but clearly those that evolve are the ones that will do well in the future. So the last thing I want to comment on briefly is, why does this all matter? And I guess I've hinted at that I think we know that climate change is probably the most critical issue of our time and our generation. And the new 5th assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reaffirms the urgency of action on climate change. It raises the level of certainty that climate change is human caused to 95%. It recommends a global carbon budget. And it says that a transition to a cleaner energy economy really has to come within a couple of decades at the very most, at the very outside, to be able to turn this around. So why does this really matter to Minnesota? And I could talk about that for my whole time. I have a bunch of slides on that, but I'm not gonna do that unless you want to ask about it. But I'll say just generally why this matters to Minnesota. And I work in state government. I've worked in state government for a long time from different perspectives. And I will tell you that I know Minnesota is poised to be a leader in a new energy economy, in a clean energy economy. And many of you know this, but I just want to make sure you do, that Minnesota has no indigenous fossil fuels. We have abundant forests and farms and wind and sun and water, but we don't have fossil fuel. In fact, about 2/3 of our energy dollars leave the state because we are reliant on fossil fuels. But we have already set our state on a path towards cleaner energy, and it's a gradual transition. We have a number of laws and policies on the books, which I can talk about if you would like. Many of the trends that I mentioned are moving forward and are taking root in Minnesota and in other places. We have strong goals in place. We have strong leadership by our governor, by our universities, and by a lot of companies. And what we do in Minnesota does drive national policy. I've been in recent conversations in Washington talking with industries and states and the Obama administration about EPA and the rules, and they are really, really interested in hearing about the perspective of heartland states that are traditionally dependent on coal and have a strong economy and have moved forward on developing clean energy sources. And Minnesota really is the leader in that universe. We have done some really unique things that the rest of the country is looking at. They want to know how we can be one of the fastest growing economies in the world and do the things that we're doing. One of the fastest growing economies in the country. So, but what we do can help drive national policy, and that can help drive global policy. And our leadership in a transform energy economy, I think, is a huge opportunity for us, and I think we're poised for a really bright future if all these predictions come true. So I think I'll stop there and take your questions and comments and thoughts.